Happy birthday to me, I whispered, standing frozen in the doorway of my husband's study. James didn't notice me. He was too busy showing his mistress, Victoria, the divorce papers spread across his mahogany desk. The party's perfect timing, she purred, running her fingers along his shoulder. Once the guests leave, you can tell her everything's over. I should have known something was wrong when James insisted on hosting my 40th birthday party at our home instead of the restaurant I'd chosen. It'll be more intimate, he'd said, that practiced smile playing across his face. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The same smile he'd perfected over our 15 years of marriage. The one that had convinced countless corporate boards of his brilliance. The one I once believed was reserved only for me. The spring evening had started perfectly. Our Tudor-style home was filled with the warmth of laughter and conversation, the scent of peonies, my favorite flowers, wafting through every room. Friends, colleagues, and family members mingled in the garden, their voices carrying through the open French doors. I'd spent weeks planning every detail, from the hand-calligraphed place cards to the three-tiered cake waiting in the kitchen. Have you seen James? I asked my best friend Melissa, who was sipping champagne by the koi pond. She frowned slightly, her dark eyes scanning the crowd. I think I saw him heading inside with Victoria. Probably some urgent work matter they need to discuss. Victoria Chun, his new executive assistant of 9 months. Young, ambitious, and always perfectly composed in her designer suits. I noticed how she looked at him during the company Christmas party, but I dismissed it as simple admiration. After all, James was one of Chicago's most respected investment bankers. Everyone looked at him that way. On your birthday? Melissa's voice carried a note of concern. That's a bit much, even for James. Something in her tone made my stomach clench. I'd been ignoring the signs for months, the late nights at the office, the mysterious weekend meetings, the way he'd changed his phone's password. But tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was supposed to be about us, about celebrating. I'll go find them, I said, forcing a smile. Make sure everyone's getting enough champagne. I walked through our home, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors. The sound echoed through the hallways past the family photos that lined the walls, memories of happier times, of vacations in Santorini, Christmas mornings, and lazy Sunday brunches. Each step felt heavier than the last as I approached James's study. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of warm light spilling into the darkened hallway. I heard their voices before I saw them, hushed but clear in the relative quiet of the house's interior. Everything's prepared, Victoria's voice, silky and confident. I've double-checked all the documents. Once you serve her the papers tonight, there's nothing she can do. You're sure about the timing? James's voice, the one he used when finalizing a deal. After the party, seems cruel. It's perfect timing, Victoria replied. She'll be emotional, vulnerable, more likely to sign quickly without scrutinizing everything. We've worked too hard to let her find out about the offshore accounts or the property transfers. I stood there, my hand pressed against the door frame, my world tilting on its axis. The party sounds faded to a distant hum as blood rushed in my ears. Through the gap in the door, I could see them clearly. Victoria perched on the edge of his desk, her skirt riding up her thighs, while James leaned back in his leather chair, divorce papers spread between them like a battle plan. You're brilliant, you know that? James said, reaching for her hand. I couldn't have planned this without you. Once everything's settled, we can finally be together openly. And the prenup? Victoria asked, her fingers intertwining with his. James laughed, that rich, confident laugh I'd once loved. Ironclad. She'll walk away with barely enough to rent an apartment. After all, I drafted it myself. The crystal champagne flute in my hand suddenly felt too heavy. I watched as Victoria leaned down, her lips meeting James's in a practiced kiss. They'd done this before, probably countless times, right here in our home. We should head back, Victoria said, pulling away. People will notice we're gone. Let them, James replied, pulling her closer. In a few hours, none of it will matter. I backed away from the door, my legs trembling. 15 years of marriage, of building a life together, and he'd planned to end it all on my birthday, in front of our friends and family. The humiliation would have been absolute, exactly as they'd planned. Melissa was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, concern etched across her face. One look at me, and she knew. "What happened?" she whispered, taking the champagne flute from my shaking hand. "I need your help," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "And I need you to call your brother." Melissa's brother Kevin was a forensic accountant who'd helped uncover some of Chicago's biggest financial frauds. If James thought he could hide money from me, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. "Whatever you need," Melissa said, already pulling out her phone. "But first, we need to get through this party without letting them know you've discovered their plan." I nodded, straightening my shoulders. James had taught me something after all those years of watching him in business meetings. Sometimes the best defense is making your opponent think they're winning. "Help me fix my makeup," I said to Melissa. "We have a party to host." As I reapplied my lipstick in the powder room, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me, her eyes harder, her smile sharper. James and Victoria thought they had orchestrated the perfect plan, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated me. I walked back into the party, accepting birthday wishes with practiced grace. James and Victoria had returned, standing slightly apart, playing their roles perfectly. I watched as he raised his glass in my direction, that familiar smile in place. "To my beautiful wife," he announced to the gathered crowd. "Happy birthday, darling." I smiled back, raising my fresh glass of champagne. Let them think they had the upper hand. Let them believe their plan was flawless. Because, while they were plotting my humiliation, they'd given me something invaluable, the element of surprise. The party continued around me, but everything had changed. Each laugh felt hollow, each congratulation tainted. But beneath the pain and betrayal, something else was growing: determination. James thought he'd written the perfect ending to our marriage. He was about to learn that this was just the beginning, and I would write the final chapter. The last guest left just before midnight, leaving behind empty champagne flutes and the lingering scent of peonies that now felt sickeningly sweet. I watched through the window as James walked Victoria to her car, their bodies maintaining a careful distance, a performance for any watching eyes. My fingers tightened around the crystal glass in my hand as he leaned in, presumably to open her door, their faces close enough for a whispered exchange. "Don't break that," Melissa said softly, gently prying the glass from my grip. "We need you thinking clearly right now." She was right. The fury coursing through my veins wouldn't help me. I needed precision, calculation, the same skills I'd used building my own interior design firm from the ground up while James climbed the ranks at Blackwell Investment Group. "Kevin's on his way," Melissa continued, setting the glass aside. "He said to secure any financial documents you can find without raising suspicion, bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, anything that might show where James has been hiding money." I nodded, my mind already cataloging the possible locations. "His study has a safe behind the Klimt print. He thinks I don't know the combination, but I saw him input it last Christmas." The memory stung. I'd been watching him that day to see what he was hiding, thinking it might be my gift. How naive I'd been. The front door opened, and James's footsteps echoed through the foyer. Melissa squeezed my hand. "Remember, let him think he's in control. We need time to build our case." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. James appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, that practiced smile still in place. "Wonderful party, darling, though you must be exhausted. Why don't you head up to bed? I have a few work emails to review." Work emails? Is that what he called the divorce papers now? I forced a smile, years of hosting his business dinners, making it feel almost natural. "Of course. Don't work too late." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. Melissa gathered her things, playing her part perfectly. "Thanks for a lovely evening. Lunch tomorrow." Her tone was casual, but her eyes conveyed the urgency. We had work to do. Perfect, I replied. That new place on Lakeshore Drive. Once Melissa left, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, our shared space of 15 years that now felt like a stranger's room. How many nights had he lain beside me, planning my downfall? How many mornings had he kissed me goodbye before meeting Victoria? I heard his study door close, followed by the muffled sound of his voice, probably calling Victoria, unable to wait even an hour before speaking to her again. I changed into silk pajamas, an anniversary gift from James that I now wanted to burn, and pretended to settle into bed. 2 hours later, his footsteps moved from his study to the guest room. He didn't even try to hide it anymore, his excuse of late-night work wearing thin months ago. The guest room had gradually accumulated his things, a spare toothbrush, pajamas, his favorite robe, another sign I'd chosen to ignore. Once I was certain he was asleep, I slipped out of bed. The house creaked familiarly beneath my feet as I made my way to his study. The Klimt print swung aside silently. I'd oiled the hinges last week under the guise of spring cleaning, revealing the wall safe. July 14th, 08, our wedding date. The irony wasn't lost on me as the safe clicked open. Inside, organized with his typical precision, lay folders of documents. My hands trembled as I used my phone to photograph each page, careful to return them exactly as I'd found them. Bank statements showing large transfers to accounts I'd never seen. Property deeds for a lakefront condo in Michigan purchased 7 months ago. And there, at the bottom, a manila envelope containing a copy of the divorce papers he planned to serve me. I photographed everything, my lawyer's daughter instincts kicking in about maintaining evidence. As I reached to replace the last folder, something caught my eye, a small velvet jewelry box tucked in the back corner. Inside lay a platinum bracelet I'd never seen, the price tag still attached. An early birthday gift for Victoria, no doubt. The sound of a door opening somewhere in the house sent me into action. Everything back in place, safe closed, painting straightened. I was halfway to the door when James's voice froze me in place. Trouble sleeping, darling? He stood in the doorway, wearing the monogrammed robe I'd given him last Christmas, his expression curious. But I caught the flash of concern in his eyes. Good. Let him worry. Looking for aspirin, I said, gesturing to my head. Too much champagne, I suppose. In my study, he forced a laugh. Force of habit. I forgot you moved it to the guest bath. A pointed comment that made him shift uncomfortably.
Right.
Well, try to get some rest. Big day at the firm tomorrow. I slipped past him, feeling his eyes on my back. In our bedroom, I finally allowed myself to breathe. My phone felt heavy in my pocket, weighted with evidence of his betrayal. I sent a quick text to Melissa. Documents secured. Meet earlier. Her response was immediate. 7 a.m. Kevin's bringing a friend, a divorce attorney who owes him a favor. Sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, my mind racing through 15 years of memories, re-examining them for signs I'd missed. The late-night calls he'd step out to take, the business trips that seemed to multiply after Victoria joined the firm, the way he'd grown protective of his phone, angling it away when messages arrived. Around dawn, I heard him leave for his morning run, another recent habit that coincided with Victoria's early morning yoga sessions at the park near our house. How many of their plans had been made during those innocent-seeming exercise routines? I dressed carefully, selecting a cream silk blouse and charcoal pencil skirt that projected confidence and control. In the kitchen, I went through the motions of my morning routine, brewing coffee I wouldn't drink, setting out his preferred breakfast dishes. The security camera I'd installed last week, another home improvement project, would show I'd maintained our normal schedule. Melissa was already waiting when I arrived at the cafe, Kevin beside her with a man I didn't recognize. Elizabeth, Melissa said, standing to hug me. This is Thomas Walsh, best divorce attorney in Illinois. Thomas's handshake was firm, his expression serious. Kevin filled me in. You did well documenting everything last night, but we need to move fast. Men like James, they always have contingency plans. Tell them what you found, Kevin urged, sliding a coffee toward me. For the next hour, I laid out everything, the hidden accounts, the property deeds, the carefully orchestrated plan to blindside me at my own birthday party. With each detail, Thomas's expression grew darker. Classic signs of premeditated financial concealment, Kevin said, reviewing the photos on my phone. The timing of the transfers, the property purchases through shell corporations. He's been planning this for at least a year. What do we do? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside. Thomas leaned forward, his voice low. First, we protect your assets. Then we gather more evidence. And finally, he smiled grimly, we show James exactly why you don't underestimate a woman who's built her own empire. As we outlined our strategy, my phone buzzed with a message from James. Dinner tonight to continue celebrating your birthday? I showed the message to Thomas, who nodded approvingly. Perfect. Keep him thinking everything's normal. Meanwhile, we're going to turn his perfect plan into his worst nightmare. Looking at the small group assembled around me, Melissa's fierce loyalty, Kevin's analytical brilliance, Thomas's strategic mind, I felt something I hadn't experienced since overhearing James and Victoria in the study. Hope. James thought he'd orchestrated the perfect betrayal, but he'd forgotten one crucial detail about me. I wasn't just his wife of 15 years. I was the woman who'd built a successful business from nothing, who'd navigated the cutthroat world of luxury design, who'd learned to read people as well as I read blueprints. And I was just getting started. The next morning, I sat in Thomas Walsh's corner office on the 35th floor of a downtown high-rise, watching as he and Kevin pored over the documents I'd photographed. The city skyline stretched out behind them, a stark contrast to the intimate betrayal we were dissecting. Look at this, Kevin said, pointing to a series of transactions. Regular transfers every third Friday starting 9 months ago, always $99,000, just under the reporting threshold. Classic evasion tactic. Thomas nodded, his expression grim. And all going to an LLC registered in Delaware. Victoria Chen is listed as the sole director. He looked up at me. When did you say she started working for James? 9 months and 1 week ago, I replied, the timeline suddenly crystallizing. He hired her right after his longtime assistant Caroline retired. Another piece clicked into place. Caroline, she tried to warn me, said I should pay attention to the new hire. I thought she was just being protective. Melissa, who had taken the morning off from her gallery to support me, squeezed my hand. You couldn't have known, Liz. None of us saw this coming. But I should have. The signs were there, Caroline's warning, the sudden changes in James's behavior, the way Victoria seemed to know details about our home she shouldn't have known, like how she'd mentioned our wine cellars organization system during that first dinner party we'd hosted after she was hired. There's more, Kevin continued, pulling up another document. The Michigan property. It was purchased through a different LLC, but the funding came from an account in the Cayman Islands. An account opened with money transferred from your joint savings. The room spun slightly. Our joint savings, where we'd been storing money for our retirement dreams. Dreams that now felt like cruel jokes. How much? I managed to ask. $1.9 million, Kevin said quietly. Almost exactly half of what was in the account. Thomas scribbled something in his notepad. He's being careful, I'll give him that. Taking only half suggests he's trying to stay within legal bounds while hiding the transaction itself. What about his firm? Melissa asked. Could they be involved? I shook my head. Blackwell Investment is too respected to risk their reputation, but a memory surfaced. There's a senior partner, Richard Bennett. He and James are close. I've seen them having lunch with Victoria several times. Richard Bennett, Thomas repeated, typing the name into his computer. Interesting. He specializes in offshore asset management. We should look into any connections between him and these LLCs. My phone buzzed a message from James. Working late tonight. Don't wait up. Of course he was. Victoria had yoga on Tuesdays, which meant their routine evening meetup would follow. Good, Thomas said, surprising me. That gives us time. Elizabeth, I need you to go back to your office and act completely normal. Meanwhile, we're going to set up surveillance on both James and Victoria. I know someone, Kevin added. Former FBI, now private investigator. She's discreet and thorough. Melissa stood up, straightening her blazer. I'll drive you to your office, Liz. We can't have your car parked here all day if we're maintaining appearances. As we rode the elevator down, I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls. I looked composed, professional, exactly as I needed to appear. But inside, questions tumbled through my mind. How many other secrets would we uncover? How deep did James's betrayal go? Stop, Melissa said gently. I know that look. You're spiraling into the what-ifs. Stay focused on what we can prove, what we can act on. She was right. I took a deep breath, centering myself. I need to call my assistant Zoe. If James checks the office calendar, everything needs to look routine. Back at Elizabeth Pierce Interiors, I threw myself into work. We had 3 major projects in development: a penthouse renovation, a boutique hotel lobby, and a historic home restoration. My team noticed nothing unusual as I reviewed designs, met with clients, and handled vendor calls. Only Zoe, my assistant of 6 years, sensed something was off. She'd been with me long enough to read my subtle cues. During a quiet moment between meetings, she closed my office door. Is everything okay? She asked. You seem different since the birthday party. I considered her carefully. Zoe wasn't just an assistant. She was an ally who'd helped build this company. More importantly, she handled all my business accounting. If James had tampered with any of the company's accounts, she might have noticed. Close the blinds, I said, making a decision, and pull up all our banking records from the past year. Zoe's eyes widened, but she complied without question. For the next hour, we combed through every transaction, every account balance. Everything looked normal until... Wait, Zoe said, pointing to a series of entries. These wire transfers to our Italian suppliers, something's not right. I leaned closer. We regularly transferred large sums to Italian artisans for custom pieces, but these amounts seemed inflated. Pull up the original invoices. Zoe dug through our files, spreading papers across my desk. Look at this. The actual invoices are for less than what was transferred. The difference was diverted somewhere else. I finished, my stomach churning. James had access to the company accounts as my husband and occasional legal advisor. He'd been skimming for my own business, probably counting on me trusting him too much to check the details. I photographed everything, sending the images to Thomas and Kevin. Within minutes, Kevin replied, "This is exactly what we needed. Clear evidence of financial misconduct using your company's accounts." Thomas's message followed. "Don't confront him yet. We're building a case that will leave him no wiggle room." Zoe watched me, concern etched on her face. "What do you need me to do?" "For now, nothing obvious. But I need you to flag any unusual transactions, especially international transfers." And Zoe, I met her eyes. "This stays between us." She nodded firmly. "Of course. You built this company from nothing, Elizabeth. I won't let anyone threaten that." By late afternoon, Kevin's investigator had already made progress. Melissa forwarded me photos showing James and Victoria leaving a real estate office in Gold Coast, not his usual territory. His firm's offices were in the loop. The agent they met with specializes in luxury condos, Kevin's message explained. Same real estate group that handled the Michigan property. They were house hunting, planning their future while dismantling mine. The thought should have devastated me, but instead, it hardened my resolve. I worked late, knowing James wouldn't be home anyway. In the quiet of my office, surrounded by the designs and plans that represented years of hard work, I began my own investigation. Every joint account, every shared investment, every property decision. I documented it all. Around 8, Melissa brought dinner and news. The PI followed them to a restaurant in River North. Very cozy, very intimate. She got photos and audio. I forced myself to eat while Melissa played the recording. James's voice, warm and intimate in a way it hadn't been with me for months, discussing their future plans. Victoria's laughter followed by discussion of the divorce timeline. After the Westbrook merger wraps up, James was saying, the publicity from closing will overshadow any gossip about the divorce. Plus, the bonus will help with the new place. The Westbrook merger, his biggest deal of the year. The irony wasn't lost on me. Send everything to Thomas, I said, pushing away my barely touched dinner. And I need you to do something else for me. Something James would never expect. Melissa raised an eyebrow.
What?
Call your friend at the Chicago Tribune, the one who writes the society column. A plan was forming, one that would use James's own strategy against him. I think it's time to ensure our divorce gets exactly the right kind of attention. As Melissa made the call, I stared out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, James and Victoria were planning their happy ending. But they'd forgotten something crucial. Every good story needs a plot twist. And I was about to deliver one they'd never see coming. The Chicago Tribune Society columnist Olivia Parker met me for coffee at an obscure cafe in Evanston, far from James's usual haunts. Melissa's connection had paid off. Olivia was intrigued by the possibility of an exclusive story about one of Chicago's most prominent investment bankers. So, Olivia said, stirring her latte, you want me to hold this information until exactly the right moment? Her shrewd eyes studied me over her vintage cat-eye glasses. Yes, I replied, sliding across a folder of carefully selected documents. These show the timeline of their relationship, the property purchases, the financial transfers. But there's more coming. When the Westbrook merger concludes next month, that's when you want this to break. Right when he's expecting to bask in the publicity of closing his biggest deal, Olivia finished, thumbing through the papers. Deliciously strategic. But why tell me now? Because I need you to start laying the groundwork, small mentions of their professional relationship, innocent coverage of their public appearances. Make them feel secure. Watched, but safe. Olivia's smile widened. Make them think they're controlling the narrative. Exactly. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a message from Kevin's PI, more photos of James and Victoria, this time entering a private viewing at an exclusive jewelry store on Michigan Avenue. The same one where he'd bought my engagement ring 15 years ago. Look at this, I said, showing Olivia the photos. They're not even trying to hide anymore. They think they're untouchable, Olivia replied, her tone knowing. I've covered enough high-profile divorces to recognize the pattern. They think their power makes them invisible. After Olivia left, I met with Thomas and Kevin at their temporary command center, a private office they'd rented under Kevin's consulting firm's name. The walls were covered with timelines, financial charts, and surveillance photos. 6 weeks of investigation had revealed a betrayal far deeper than I'd initially imagined. The jewelry store visit confirms it, Kevin said, pinning up the latest photos. He's liquidating assets through luxury purchases, harder to trace than direct transfers. Thomas nodded, adding another note to his growing file. Classic strategy. The jewelry becomes gifts that can be sold later for cash. But he made a mistake. The store requires insurance registration for major purchases. We can subpoena those records. Melissa burst in, waving her tablet. You need to see this. Victoria just updated her private Instagram account. The photo showed a delicate hand, Victoria's, resting on a restaurant table, a distinctive ring glinting on her finger. The caption was cryptic. New beginnings coming soon. The location tag showed an upscale restaurant in Indianapolis, 2 hours from Chicago. They're getting sloppy, Thomas observed. Too confident. This helps us establish a pattern of ongoing relationship. There's more, Melissa continued, scrolling through her tablet. I had my gallery assistant do some digging. Victoria is not just James's executive assistant. She used to work for Richard Bennett, the senior partner. The pieces clicked together. That's how they met, I said, standing to pace the room. Richard must have introduced them, knowing James was looking for a new assistant when Caroline retired. Kevin was already typing on his laptop. Richard Bennett, let me check something. His fingers flew over the keyboard. Got it. He's listed as a director on one of the LLCs that received money from James's hidden accounts. They're all in it together, I realized. Richard helped set up the offshore accounts, introduced James to Victoria, probably helped plan the whole thing. Thomas was making notes rapidly. This is good. The more people involved, the more likely someone will crack under pressure. We should. He was interrupted by my phone ringing. James's face appeared on the screen. I held up a hand for silence and answered, keeping my voice casual. Hi, honey. Elizabeth. James's voice was warm, practiced. I was thinking about our anniversary next month. What if we took a trip, just the two of us? My heart pounded. Our anniversary was 3 weeks after the Westbrook merger concluded, when he was planning to serve the divorce papers. He wanted to take me away to do it privately, minimize the public scandal. That sounds wonderful, I replied, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. Where were you thinking? Santorini, like our honeymoon. The same place he'd promised we'd return to for our 15th anniversary. Now I understood. He wanted to recreate our happiest memory before destroying it all. Perfect, I said. Should I call our travel agent? No need. I'll have Victoria handle all the arrangements. Of course he would. I ended the call and turned to the others, my hands shaking with rage. He's planning to serve me the divorce papers during our anniversary trip to Santorini. Melissa swore under her breath. Thomas, however, looked thoughtful. This could work in our favor. If he's focusing on the anniversary plan, he'll be distracted from what we're doing. Which is exactly what we need, Kevin added, pulling up another document, because look what I found in the LLC paperwork. Victoria's not just listed as a director. She's been receiving a salary from one of James's clients' companies for the past year. I moved closer to see the screen. The company name was familiar, Westbrook Industries, the target of the merger James was handling. Why would they be paying her? They wouldn't, Thomas said grimly, unless James arranged it as part of his fee. Which means he's been billing clients for her salary while she's supposedly working as his assistant. That's fraud, I finished. And not just against me. Against his firm and his clients, Thomas confirmed. This is the kind of thing that gets investment bankers barred from the industry. The implications were staggering. James hadn't just betrayed me. He'd compromised his entire career, his professional ethics, everything he'd spent decades building. Zoe called as we were processing this latest revelation. Elizabeth, there's something else. I've been going through old records and I found something strange. Remember that fundraiser James helped organize last year? The Children's Hospital Benefit. What about it? The donations that were supposed to go through our company account as sponsorship, they never reached the hospital. They were redirected to another account first. My blood ran cold. James had handled all the legal aspects of my company's charitable giving. How much? $300,000. Zoe's voice was tight with anger. I've got the paper trail. He used our company's reputation to legitimize the transfers, then diverted the funds. I shared this new information with the others. Thomas immediately grasped the significance. This is perfect. Charitable fraud is toxic for an investment banker's reputation. No jury would be sympathetic. We need to move carefully, Kevin cautioned. Start gathering sworn statements from everyone involved, Zoe, the hospital administrators, the bank officers who handled the transfers. Melissa was already making calls, her gallery assistant researching more connections between Victoria, Richard Bennett, and James's other clients. As the evidence mounted, a clear picture emerged. James hadn't just planned to divorce me. He'd orchestrated a years-long conspiracy involving multiple parties, using my business, his firm's resources, and even charitable donations to fund his new life with Victoria. The Westbrook merger concludes in 3 weeks, Thomas said, reviewing our timeline. Then he plans to take you to Santorini 2 weeks after that. We need to be ready before then. I stared at the wall of evidence, each photo and document representing another layer of betrayal. James thought he was playing a sophisticated game, but he'd forgotten something crucial about me. I'd spent 15 years watching him work, learning how he thought, understanding his strategies. And now I was going to use everything he taught me to destroy everything he'd built. Call Olivia, I told Melissa. Tell her to start dropping those breadcrumbs in her column. Let's make James and Victoria feel secure in their perfect plan. As Melissa made the call, I added one final note to our timeline. Anniversary trip, Santorini. But unlike James's version, this wouldn't be an ending. It would be my beginning. Olivia's first article appeared in the Chicago Tribune Society pages 3 days later, a seemingly innocent piece about power couples in Chicago's financial world. James and I were featured prominently, with a subtle mention of his dedicated new executive assistant who had helped streamline his prestigious practice. The photo showed us at my birthday party, James's arm around my waist, Victoria visible in the deep background. "Perfect," Thomas said, reading the article in his office. "Establishing the background while hiding the knife." I studied the photo, remembering the moment it was taken, just minutes after I'd overheard them in the study. All of us playing our parts perfectly. "James called me this morning," I said. "He's already booked the Santorini trip through Victoria, of course." "Of course," Melissa muttered from her position by the window. "Because every husband has his assistant book his anniversary trip." Kevin entered carrying a thick folder. "Speaking of Victoria, you won't believe what we found." He spread documents across Thomas's desk. "She's been busy. 3 new bank accounts opened in the past month, all under different variations of her name. Victoria Chen, v. Chen Bennett v. Whitney Bennett." "Bennett?" I asked, the name triggering something in my memory. "Her mother's maiden name," Kevin confirmed. "She's establishing alternate identities, classic preparation for moving money quietly." James picked up one of the documents. "These accounts, they're all at banks where Westbrook Industries does business." "Exactly." Kevin pulled up more records on his laptop. "And look at this. Westbrook Industries just opened a new division in Singapore. Care to guess who's handling the legal work?" "Richard Bennett," I said, the pieces clicking together. "They're setting up their escape route. Once the divorce is final, they'll probably transfer Victoria to the Singapore office, with James joining later under the guise of expanding the firm's international presence." "Not if we can help it," Thomas replied grimly. "These overseas accounts give us leverage. No judge looks kindly on hidden assets, especially when they cross international borders." Melissa's phone buzzed. "Zoe just sent something interesting. James visited your office yesterday while you were at the site meeting." My head snapped up. "What?" "Security footage shows him accessing your private files. Zoe says he spent almost an hour in your office." Thomas was already reaching for his phone. "We need to sweep for devices. If he's planted anything—" "No," I interrupted, a realization hitting me. He wasn't planting anything. He was looking for evidence that I know. I turned to Kevin. "Can we use this?" "The unauthorized access." "Definitely. It shows consciousness of guilt, plus potential corporate espionage if he accessed any client files." A knock at the door made us all freeze. Thomas's assistant poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here you need to meet." She stepped aside, revealing an elegant older woman I recognized immediately. "Caroline?" I stood, shocked to see James's former assistant. "What are you doing here?" Caroline Reynolds had been James's assistant for over 15 years before her sudden retirement. She closed the door behind her, her expression determined. "I've been following Olivia's column, reading between the lines. And it's time you knew the real reason I retired." For the next hour, Caroline revealed a pattern of behavior that made my blood run cold. James and Richard Bennett had been planning this for years. Victoria wasn't just a random hire. She'd been carefully selected and groomed for her role. "They started positioning her 2 years ago," Caroline explained. "Richard would bring her to firm events, introduce her around. I noticed how she always managed to be wherever James was. Then the documents started disappearing." "What documents?" Thomas asked sharply. "Financial records, client billing statements." At first, I thought I was just misplacing things. Then I found copies of privileged documents in Victoria's desk, papers she shouldn't have had access to. "Did you confront them?" I asked. Caroline's laugh was bitter. "I tried. That's when the threat started. Subtle at first, comments about my age, about modernizing the firm. Then Richard Bennett made it clear, take early retirement with a generous package or face accusations of incompetence. They forced you out," Melissa realized, "to make way for Victoria. And to protect their scheme," Caroline added. "I have copies of everything I managed to document, dates, transactions, meetings. I've been waiting for the right moment to come forward." Thomas was already pulling out a legal pad. "We need to get your official statement." This establishes a long-term pattern of conspiracy. As Caroline detailed everything she'd witnessed, I remembered all the times she'd tried to warn me in her subtle way. The concerned looks, the careful comments about keeping my own records, her insistence that I maintain separate accounts for my business. "There's something else," Caroline said, reaching into her bag. The day before I left, I made copies of James's private calendar, including entries about meetings with Victoria going back 18 months before I retired. Kevin whistled softly as he reviewed the calendar. "This is gold, shows premeditation, directly contradicts any claim that the relationship started after she was hired." "Why didn't you show me this before?" I asked Caroline softly. She met my eyes. "Would you have believed it then? Sometimes we need to discover the truth in our own time, when we're ready to see it." She was right. Even if she'd shown me proof months ago, I probably would have found ways to explain it away. I needed to catch them in the act myself to finally accept the truth. Melissa's phone buzzed again, another update from the PI. James and Victoria just had lunch with Richard Bennett at that new place on the waterfront. They looked celebratory. "The Westbrook merger," Thomas said. "The trial run starts next week. They must be confident about closing the deal." I stood, moving to the window. Below, Chicago's financial district hummed with activity, oblivious to the drama unfolding in this office. "They think everything's falling into place," I said quietly. "The merger will end in triumph. The divorce will be handled quietly during the Santorini trip, and they'll start their new life with no one the wiser." "Speaking of the Westbrook merger," Kevin interjected, "I found something interesting in those company records. There's a connection to Bennett's other clients, a series of transactions that look unusual." Thomas leaned forward. "What kind of connection?" "The kind that suggests James might be using privileged information from one client to benefit another. If this is what I think it is, it's not just fraud. It's insider trading," I finished. "And securities fraud." Caroline nodded slowly. "That fits with patterns I noticed. James and Richard were always very careful about keeping certain client files separate from the main system. The implications were staggering. James hadn't just betrayed me. He'd potentially compromised multiple client relationships, violated securities laws, and exposed his firm to massive liability. "We need to move carefully," Thomas cautioned. "This is bigger than a divorce case now. We're talking potential criminal charges." "Good," I said, my voice hard. "Let's use everything. While they're focused on the Westbrook merger and planning their perfect getaway, we'll be building a trap they can't escape." Diana squeezed my hand. "What's our next move?" I looked at the team assembled around me. Thomas with his legal expertise, Kevin with his financial acumen, Melissa with her unwavering support, Caroline with her damning evidence, and Zoe still digging through company records. "We let them play out their hand," I decided. "Let James close his merger. Let him think everything's going according to plan. Meanwhile, we document everything, build our case, and prepare for the moment when, Melissa prompted. "When I serve him divorce papers," I smiled grimly, "at the exact moment he plans to serve me, in Santorini, in front of everyone who matters in his world." The room fell silent as they absorbed the audacity of the plan. Finally, Thomas nodded approvingly. "Poetic justice. But we'll need to time everything perfectly." "Leave that to me," Caroline said. "I still have friends at the firm. I can help coordinate the timing." As we began plotting out the details, I felt a strange sense of calm. James had spent years crafting his betrayal, thinking he was the master strategist. But he'd forgotten something crucial. He wasn't the only one who knew how to play the long game. And my game was just beginning. The Westbrook merger's signing day arrived with the kind of media coverage James had always craved. Local news stations clustered outside Blackwell Investment Group's headquarters, their cameras trained on my husband as he strode up the steps, projecting confidence in his bespoke Italian suit. Victoria walked 2 careful steps behind him, carrying his briefcase and looking every bit the devoted assistant. I watched the coverage from Thomas's office, noting how Victoria's designer outfit probably cost more than a month's legitimate salary. "Ready?" Thomas asked, straightening his tie. "Absolutely." I smoothed down my own suit, a power outfit I'd chosen specifically for today. Caroline's contact confirmed everything's in place?
Yes.
Your name's on the witness list as a character witness for Westbrook CEO. James has no idea. We added it last minute. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. James had been so focused on the complex financial aspects of the Westbrook merger, he hadn't bothered to review the final witness list thoroughly. Why would he? His wife had no connection to the merger, or so he thought. Melissa met us at Blackwell's headquarters, Kevin beside her with a briefcase full of documents. Victoria just went in, she reported. She looked nervous. She should be, Kevin replied grimly. Wait until she sees what's coming. We entered the boardroom just as the proceedings were about to begin. James was at the head table, his head bent close to Westbrook's CEO as they whispered urgently. He didn't notice us sitting in the gallery, another miscalculation on his part. The opening statements were detailed and impressive, laying out the structure of the merger that would create one of the largest investment conglomerates in the Midwest. Throughout it all, James maintained his composed demeanor, occasionally making notes or whispering to Victoria, who sat directly behind him, her face a mask of professional attention. Then the signing ceremony began, with each executive affirming their role in the new combined entity. James stood for his presentation. This was his element, commanding the room, weaving narratives that made boards lean forward in their seats. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying that practiced sincerity, what we have here is not just a merger of companies, but a fusion of visionaries with complementary strengths and aligned values. I watched him work his magic, remembering all the times I'd seen him practice these performances in our home office. How many of those late nights had actually been spent with Victoria, rehearsing more than just business strategy? The morning proceeded with each party signing their respective documents. During a brief recess, I saw James finally notice our presence. His step faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, approaching our group with that perfect smile. Elizabeth, darling, he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. I didn't expect to see you here. His eyes flicked to Thomas. And James Walsh? What brings you to a merger signing? Professional interest, Thomas replied smoothly. Fascinating deal structure, James. James's eyes narrowed slightly, but before he could respond, Victoria appeared at his elbow. Mr. Pierce, the Westbrook team has some additional clauses they want to review before the final signing. I watched them retreat to a conference room, noting how their bodies angled toward each other automatically. They thought they were being subtle. They had no idea how obvious their connection had become once you knew to look for it. All set, Kevin murmured, checking his phone. I nodded. The final signing was about to begin, setting up our trap. The afternoon session began with a formal merger document being prepared for signatures from all parties. The atmosphere was triumphant. Champagne was already being brought in for the toast that would follow. Then the head of the signing committee announced, before we proceed to the final signatures, Elizabeth Pierce has been asked to make a statement about the community impact of this merger. The reaction was immediate. James's head snapped up from his notes, his face showing genuine shock for the first time I could remember. Victoria dropped her pen, scrambling to retrieve it as I walked confidently to the podium. After I was introduced, James approached, struggling to maintain his composure. Mrs. Pierce, he began, his voice carefully modulated. Could you please explain your involvement in this merger? Certainly, I smiled. Besides being your wife, I'm also aware of some concerning financial practices related to this transaction. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. James froze, his practiced poise cracking. I don't understand. Through my interior design firm, I've uncovered a pattern of suspicious financial transactions linked to both Blackwell and Westbrook Industries, I continued pleasantly. In fact, I have quite detailed records of these irregularities. James's face had gone pale. He knew what was coming. All those transactions he'd hidden, all the money he'd diverted through my company's accounts, it was all about to come to light. Your Honor, I mean, Mr. Chairman, he stammered. I request a brief recess. Denied. The Westbrook CEO replied sharply. Please continue, Mrs. Pierce. For the next 30 minutes, I walked the assembled executives through a carefully choreographed presentation. Every question James asked only opened another door he didn't want opened. Every attempt to redirect only made things worse. Through it all, I maintained a pleasant, helpful demeanor, just a concerned citizen doing her civic duty. And these financial records, I said, gesturing to the documents Thomas had ready, show a pattern of transactions involving Westbrook funds being diverted through shell companies registered to Victoria Chen. James was sweating now, his perfect composure shattered. In the gallery, Victoria sat rigid with tension, her knuckles white around her notebook. She could see it too, their careful plans beginning to unravel. No further questions, James finally managed, retreating to his seat. The Westbrook CEO rose, fury evident in every movement. "Mrs. Pierce, are you suggesting that our merger has been compromised by financial improprieties?" "Not the merger itself," I clarified. "But certainly some of the participants have been operating with conflicting interests." I gestured to Thomas, who distributed folders to each board member. These documents show transfers from Westbrook corporate accounts to personal accounts held by James Pierce, Victoria Chen, and Richard Bennett. They also show similar patterns with 3 other Blackwell clients. The room erupted in chaos. The Westbrook team huddled together, their faces dark with anger. The Blackwell senior partners, including Richard Bennett, were frantically flipping through the evidence. James stood alone at the center of the storm, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. "This meeting is adjourned pending a full investigation," the chairman announced. "No one leaves the building until we've sorted this out." As security personnel moved to secure the exits, I made eye contact with James across the room. For the first time in our marriage, I saw something I'd never seen before: fear. Phase 1 accomplished. In the aftermath, the Blackwell partners sequestered themselves in a conference room while the Westbrook team demanded answers. Victoria was being questioned by the firm's compliance officers, her designer outfit looking suddenly inappropriate as she hunched over, responding to rapid-fire questions. I met with Thomas, Kevin, and Melissa in a small side office the security team had provided. "That went even better than expected," Thomas said, reviewing his notes. "The Westbrook CEO is already talking about pressing charges." "James will try to damage control," Kevin warned. "He'll want to know how much you've discovered, how long you've been investigating." "Let him wonder," I replied, feeling truly confident for the first time in weeks. "While he's scrambling to cover his tracks here, he won't see what's coming next." My phone buzzed with a message from Caroline. Emergency partner meeting called. James, Victoria, and Richard being questioned separately. Everything was falling into place. The first cracks had appeared in James's perfect facade, and they would only grow larger. He'd spent years building his house of cards, thinking he was untouchable. Today we'd pulled out the first card. Soon, the whole thing would come crashing down. I arrived home to find James waiting in the kitchen, his tie loosened, a glass of scotch in his hand. "Want to tell me what that was about today?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Just doing my civic duty," I replied innocently. "After all, you always say everyone should be transparent in business dealings." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Some of those records you mentioned, where did you get them?" "Oh, you know me," I smiled, heading upstairs. "I like to keep good business records for tax purposes." Let him stew on that, I thought as I closed our bedroom door. Let him wonder what else I might have documented, what else I might know. The Santorini trip was still 3 weeks away. By then, we'd have everything in place for the final act of this drama. James thought today was just an unfortunate surprise. He had no idea it was just the beginning. As I got ready for bed, I heard him on the phone in his study, his voice carrying an edge of urgency I'd never heard before. Phase 1 had accomplished exactly what we'd hoped. The first victory in what would become a war. And I was just getting started. The morning after my boardroom testimony, Chicago's financial community was buzzing with speculation. Olivia's latest column, strategically placed in the Tribune's business section, raised pointed questions about the connections between the collapsed Westbrook merger and several other Blackwell clients. I sat in my office at Elizabeth Pierce Interiors watching the dominoes begin to fall. Zoe had just forwarded an email from Blackwell's managing partner requesting a meeting to discuss our ongoing business relationship. They were getting nervous. "Mrs. Pierce," my intercom buzzed, "there's a Mr. Westbrook here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment." I exchanged glances with Melissa, who had been reviewing our latest evidence. This was unexpected but not unwelcome. "Send him in." Robert Westbrook strode into my office looking considerably less polished than he had in the boardroom yesterday. His designer suit was slightly rumpled, his face bearing the shadows of a sleepless night. "Mrs. Pierce," he said, declining my offer to sit, "I think we need to have a frank discussion about what's really going on." "Of course," I replied, gesturing for Melissa to stay as she moved to leave. "What would you like to discuss?" Westbrook paced, agitation clear in every movement. "Those transactions you mentioned in the boardroom yesterday, the ones involving your design firm and my company's accounts. I've been up all night reviewing them with my private accountants." He stopped pacing, fixing me with an intense stare. "There are discrepancies, large ones. Money that was supposedly going to office renovations, but seems to have disappeared." I opened my laptop, turning it to show him a spreadsheet Zoe had prepared. "You mean transactions like these?" His face paled as he scanned the numbers. "These are different from what James showed me. He said all the extra costs were for premium materials, custom orders from Italy." "Some were," I acknowledged, "but not all. Notice the routing numbers on these transfers." Westbrook leaned closer, his banking background evident in the way he quickly grasped the implications. "These went through shell companies before reaching your vendors." "But why would James?" He trailed off, realization dawning. "He's been skimming from the transactions." "Not just from yours," I added quietly. "We found similar patterns with other clients." Westbrook sank into a chair, his composure finally cracking. "The SEC has been looking into my company's finances for months. James promised he could handle it, said he had everything under control. But if these transactions come to light, they already have." I handed him a copy of the latest regulatory filings. "The authorities submitted subpoenas this morning for all related banking records." "I'll be ruined," Westbrook whispered. Then his head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "Unless you're showing me this for a reason. What do you want?" "The truth," I replied simply. "About everything. James's involvement, Richard Bennett's role, all of it. In exchange, my evidence might help show you were also a victim of fraud." Westbrook was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he reached for his phone. "I need to make some calls, starting with my attorneys." After he left, Melissa let out a low whistle. That was unexpected. "Think he'll really turn on James?" "He has to," I replied. "It's his only play now. Better to be seen as a victim than a co-conspirator." My phone buzzed, a message from James. "We need to talk about Westbrook coming to your office." Melissa raised an eyebrow. "Perfect timing. Want me to stay?" "No, but have Kevin ready with the recording equipment. Every conversation counts now." 20 minutes later, James arrived looking immaculate as always, but with tension visible around his eyes. Victoria wasn't with him. "Interesting. Elizabeth," he began, closing my office door. "About yesterday. About the evidence of financial fraud?" I interrupted pleasantly. "Or about how your client just left my office with proof that you've been manipulating his accounts." James froze for a split second before recovering. "There seems to be some confusion about those transactions. If you'll let me explain." "Explain what?" "How you used my company to launder money. How you and Richard Bennett set up fake vendor accounts to siphon funds. Or maybe you'd like to explain Victoria's role in all this." "Victoria?" His laugh was forced. "She's just my assistant. She processes paperwork, nothing more." "Really?" I turned my monitor to show him a document. "Then why is she listed as director on 3 companies that received diverted funds? Companies registered to the same address as your beach house in Michigan." The color drained from his face. "How did you get access to these records?" I smiled. "Let's just say Caroline was very thorough in her documentation before she retired." James sank into a chair, his perfect posture crumbling. "Elizabeth, whatever you think you know." "I know everything, James. Every transaction, every secret meeting, every plan you and Victoria made, including your plans for our anniversary trip. His head snapped up. Santorini? Did you really think serving me divorce papers on the beach where we honeymooned was clever? Or was that Victoria's idea of poetic justice? Before he could respond, my intercom buzzed again. Mrs. Pierce, there are some gentlemen here from the Securities and Exchange Commission. They have a warrant. James stood so quickly he knocked over his chair. I pressed the intercom button. Send them in. Elizabeth, he said urgently, whatever you're doing, think carefully. We can work something out. Like you work things out with Westbrook? With your other clients? With the Children's Hospital Charity Funds? The door opened to reveal two serious-looking men in dark suits. James Pierce. One asked, though it clearly wasn't a question. We need you to come with us. We have some questions about certain financial transactions. As they led James out, I saw Victoria rushing down the hallway, panic clear on her face. She stopped short at the sight of the SEC agents, her designer handbag slipping from nerveless fingers. My phone lit up with messages. Thomas. SEC got Westbrook statement. They're moving on Richard Bennett next. Kevin. Blackwell board just called an emergency meeting. Melissa. Olivia's story about the charity funds just went live. Zoe. The firm's partners are here. They want to see all our records. Everything was unraveling faster than even we had planned. James's carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing, taking Victoria and Richard Bennett down with it. I stepped into the hallway where Victoria stood frozen, watching James being escorted to the elevator. You should call a lawyer, I told her quietly. A good one. You'll need it. She turned to me, her composure finally breaking. You don't understand. We never meant to get caught. I finished. That's the thing about secrets, Victoria. They always come out eventually. Back in my office, I called Thomas to update him. James just got picked up by the SEC. Victoria's falling apart. How long until they move on Richard Bennett? Already happening, he replied. Caroline's evidence was the key. Once they saw the pattern of client fund manipulation. And the Santorini trip? Still on as far as they know. But now we have a new wrinkle. The Blackwell managing partners want to meet with you tomorrow. They're talking about a full audit of all cases involving your company. I smiled, remembering all the careful documentation Zoe and I had prepared. Perfect. Time to show them exactly how their star banker has been operating. As the day's events unfolded, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. The life I'd built with James was over, but it had died long before today. What was ending now was the illusion, the carefully maintained facade of perfection. My phone buzzed one final time, a message from Caroline. Just heard from my contact at the firm. They've suspended James pending investigation. Victoria's been escorted out of the building. The first phase of our plan had succeeded beyond expectations, but we weren't done yet. The Santorini trip was still 2 weeks away, and I had one final card to play. James thought today was devastating. He had no idea what was coming next. Santorini stretched below our private helicopter, like a crescent moon floating on the brilliant blue Aegean. Despite everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks, James had insisted on keeping our anniversary trip. His desperation to maintain appearances had worked perfectly into our plans. Beautiful, isn't